I was excited for the weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city's relentless buzz and unwind in the solitude of the Rockies. My friends and I had planned this hiking trip for months. We had our gear ready, including the latest trail maps, and set out early Saturday morning from Denver. The drive up to the trailhead was picturesque, with the sun casting long shadows over the winding road. We arrived at the trailhead, a popular spot known for its stunning views and manageable trails. As we set up our gear and prepared to start the hike, the air was filled with anticipation and the distinct aroma of pine and earth, marking the beginning of what we hoped would be a perfect weekend escape. The hike started as expected. We were making good time, chatting and laughing as we climbed higher. Around noon, we stopped for a break at a clearing. That's when I noticed something strange. A lone hiker coming down the trail at a speed that seemed unusually fast. He wore a heavy jacket and carried a large backpack, but his face was obscured by a hood. He barely acknowledged us, just a curt nod before he continued down the trail. We exchanged uneasy glances but shrugged it off. Little did we know, this brief encounter would be the start of something unsettling. As we continued our hike, we reached a secluded area off the beaten path where we decided to have lunch. The forest here was dense and the atmosphere felt oddly silent. While exploring a small side trail, I stumbled upon an old, weather-beaten backpack half buried under some leaves. It was strange. Its appearance was recent, but it was abandoned in an odd spot. Inside, there were a few personal items, a map with a section marked in red, a pair of binoculars, and a crumpled note with unintelligible scribbles. The discovery left me feeling uneasy, but I kept it to myself, not wanting to alarm the others. As dusk approached, we decided it was time to set up camp. We found a suitable spot near a small stream, set up our tents, and started a fire. The serenity of the night, however, was disrupted by an unsettling noise, an eerie distant sound that resembled a muffled scream. We brushed it off as the wind playing tricks or wildlife in the distance. Yet, the strange sound lingered in our minds, creating a subtle undercurrent of tension. We tried to focus on enjoying the evening, but the noise had planted a seed of unease that would only grow. By morning, we packed up and continued our hike, aiming to reach a scenic overlook. The trail seemed different, almost as if it had changed overnight. We took what we thought was the right path, but the further we went, the more disoriented we became. The landmarks we were familiar with from our maps were nowhere to be found. The realization hit us. We were lost. Panic set in as we retraced our steps, but the forest seemed to mock our efforts, with trees and paths that looked increasingly unfamiliar. As we tried to find our way back, we noticed a figure moving stealthily among the trees. It was the same lone hiker we'd seen earlier, only now his presence was even more unsettling. He seemed to be watching us from a distance, vanishing behind trees as we approached. Our calls for help were met with silence. The figure's constant, eerie presence heightened our anxiety. It was as if he was deliberately keeping us disoriented, manipulating our fear with his eerie games. Desperate to escape the mounting fear, we decided to split up in hopes of finding the trail or any sign of civilization. I teamed up with one friend while the others went in a different direction. The hours passed, and our situation grew increasingly dire. With no sign of the trail, and no cell phone reception, our chances of finding help seemed slim. We shouted for the others but received no response. The forest silence, punctuated only by the distant, muffled cries of wildlife, made every minute feel like an eternity. Just as hope seemed lost, we stumbled upon a clearing that resembled the one where we had found the backpack. My heart raced as I recognized the items we had found earlier scattered around the ground. It dawned on us that the hiker we had seen wasn't a chance encounter. He had been following us, possibly planning something sinister. The items, now spread out as if deliberately placed, suggested we were part of a larger, disturbing game. Our reality was shifting from a harmless hike to a nightmarish ordeal. Returning to the campsite, we were met with a chilling sight. The campfire was still burning, but our tents were gone. In their place, a crude circle of stones and a single, menacing note which read, "You're not alone." As we huddled around the fire, trying to stay calm, one of us began recounting an old campfire story about hikers who vanished in these woods. The story mirrored our situation too closely, and as the tale progressed, it became apparent that our plight was eerily similar to the legends we had just heard. The fear of being watched consumed us. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made us jump. We tried to keep our wits about us, but paranoia was taking hold. We huddled together, trying to make sense of the situation, but the constant feeling of being observed was overwhelming. Our trust in each other began to fray, each shadow and noise becoming a potential threat. We began to question if we could trust each other, further escalating our sense of dread. As night fell, we heard footsteps approaching our campsite. Our hearts pounded as the mysterious figure emerged from the darkness. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was emotionless. He didn't say a word, but simply stared at us with an unsettling calm. The confrontation was tense. We demanded answers, but he remained silent. The figure then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The encounter left us shaken. The silence that followed felt deafening, and our fears were confirmed. We were not alone, and we had no idea what his intentions were. By dawn, we had managed to find our way back to the trailhead, but the experience had left us traumatized. We reported the incident to the authorities, but there was no trace of the mysterious figure. The backpack and its contents were never recovered, and the search turned up no further clues. The ordeal had shaken us to the core, leaving us with more questions than answers. The experience became a chilling memory, a reminder of how quickly a peaceful escape can turn into a terrifying ordeal. We returned to our lives, but the fear of what we encountered lingered, leaving us forever unsettled. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend retreat. My friends and I had planned this mountain getaway for months, excited to escape the daily grind of Seattle. Nestled in the heart of the Olympic Mountains, our cabin, rented through a popular vacation site, promised seclusion and tranquility. The drive up was a peaceful contrast to the city's hustle, with winding roads and towering trees creating a natural canopy overhead. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the landscape. The cabin, rustic and charming, seemed like a cozy haven for our much-needed escape. Little did we know, our peaceful retreat would soon become a nightmare. The first evening passed without incident. We spent hours around the campfire sharing stories and laughing, the crackling flames the only sound breaking the night's silence. But as darkness deepened, I began to feel an uneasy tension in the air. It was subtle at first, strange noises in the distance, an occasional rustle in the bushes. I dismissed it as wildlife or the wind. My friends seemed unaffected, and I didn't want to ruin the mood by voicing my concerns. Yet as I lay in bed that night, the unease settled heavily in my chest, making it hard to sleep. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike alone, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. As I ventured down the trail, I stumbled upon something unsettling, a torn piece of clothing snagged on a branch. It looked like a flannel shirt, the kind you'd wear for a casual outdoor trip. I examined it, noting the frayed edges and the dark stain that resembled dried blood. My heart raced as I glanced around the forest, feeling as though I was being watched. I decided to take the shirt back to the cabin, hoping to find answers. When I showed the shirt to my friends, their reactions ranged from concern to dismissive. Jake, our resident skeptic, joked about it being a prank. Sarah, ever the optimist, suggested it was just a lost article from a previous hiker. But the doubt gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The forest, once inviting, now seemed sinister and foreboding. Every rustle in the trees and every snap of a twig made me jump. Our cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Later that day, as we prepared for a barbecue, we realized some of our food and supplies were missing. The cooler with our meat and drinks was empty, the contents gone without a trace. We searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but there were no signs of a break-in or any indication of what had happened. The missing items added to the growing sense of dread, and we began to question whether we were alone in the woods. Was someone watching us? The thought made my skin crawl. That night, the sounds from the forest grew louder and more disturbing. We heard footsteps outside the cabin, shuffling noises, and an occasional low growl that didn't belong to any animal I knew. My friends and I huddled together, trying to rationalize the noises as nothing more than wildlife or the wind. But the fear was palpable, and our attempts to laugh it off fell flat. Each creak of the cabin and every gust of wind seemed amplified, as though the forest itself was conspiring against us. The following morning, I went outside to investigate the strange noises and came face to face with a man I didn't recognize. He was unkempt, with a wild look in his eyes and clothes that seemed torn. He appeared out of nowhere, emerging from the trees, and his presence was both alarming and surreal. He mumbled something incoherent before disappearing back into the forest. I returned to the cabin, shaken and anxious, but my friends were skeptical. They suggested he might be a local resident or a hiker who had lost his way. As the day wore on, we decided to search the area around the cabin for any clues or signs of danger. The forest was dense and unwelcoming, with the trees casting ominous shadows. We scoured the underbrush and checked the trails but found nothing out of the ordinary. The encounter with the strange man left us on edge, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Our search for answers seemed fruitless, and the realization that we might be in real danger began to set in. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of the stranger and the missing items. I decided to investigate the cabin's basement, which we hadn't explored. As I descended the creaky stairs, I found a small stash of items that didn't belong to us: personal belongings, photographs, and even a journal with unsettling entries about watching people. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone had been observing us and perhaps had been here long before we arrived. The basement, once just a storage space, now felt like a horrifying secret. Panic set in as we confronted the reality of our situation. We packed up our belongings and prepared to leave, but the forest had other plans. As we made our way back to the car, we were met with resistance. Trees that seemed to block our path and strange sounds that made it clear we were not alone. The tension reached a breaking point when the strange man appeared again, this time more aggressive. He demanded we stay, his intentions unclear but menacing. We had no choice but to fight or flee. In the chaos, we managed to escape and make it back to the nearest town. However, the ordeal didn't end there. Upon reporting the incident to the local authorities, we were met with disbelief. The area was reportedly free of any known criminals, and the missing items and the stranger's identity remained a mystery. It was as if our entire experience was dismissed as a figment of our collective imagination. The lack of answers left us with more questions and an unsettling feeling that something more sinister had occurred. Even now, months later, the fear of that weekend lingers. We tried to move on, but the experience left an indelible mark. Every so often, when the wind howls through the trees or when I find myself alone in the dark, the memories of that isolated mountain retreat resurface. The cabin, the stranger, and the unsettling discoveries remain a part of my life, a haunting reminder of how a seemingly perfect escape can turn into a nightmare. The fear of what truly happened in those woods continues to haunt me, leaving me with a chilling uncertainty about the unknown. It was a cold October morning when I decided to plan a weekend escape from the chaos of city life. After months of working long hours at my job in downtown Toronto, I craved some solitude and fresh air. I wanted to retreat to a cozy remote cabin in the woods, away from the city lights and constant hum of traffic. I found a listing on Craigslist for a cabin located in the backwoods of Ontario, far from the nearest town. The place was described as the perfect getaway, secluded yet comfortable. I booked it immediately, excited about the thought of peaceful hikes and a break from my routine. Little did I know this decision would lead me into a nightmare beyond my imagination. By the time I arrived at the cabin, dusk was settling in over the dense forest. The cabin itself was charming, an old wooden structure with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the trees. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. I unloaded my gear and lit a fire to ward off the chill of the evening. The cabin's isolation was evident. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I thought it would be nice to disconnect from technology for a few days, but the sheer silence began to feel a bit unsettling. The first night passed without incident, though the eerie quiet was a stark contrast to the usual city noise I was accustomed to. As I settled in for the second night, I noticed a strange smell in the cabin, something faintly metallic, like rust. I shrugged it off as a quirk of the old cabin. I decided to take a walk around the property to stretch my legs. The path was overgrown and unkempt, and I noticed a few broken branches and displaced leaves as if someone had recently passed through. I dismissed it as animal activity, but a shiver ran down my spine. It felt as though I was not entirely alone. The second night brought more than just the cold. It also brought unsettling sounds. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by what sounded like footsteps on the porch. I went outside with a flashlight, but the area was empty. The only signs of disturbance were a few more displaced leaves. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but as the hours passed, the noises continued. Soft knocks, creaks, and the faint sound of someone moving around outside. My sense of security eroded with each sound, making it increasingly difficult to sleep. The next morning, I realized something was missing. My favorite jacket, which I had left hanging on a hook near the door. I searched the cabin thoroughly but found no trace of it. The only other person I'd seen since arriving was the cabin owner, who had shown me around briefly. I considered asking him if he had seen anything, but he had left immediately after the tour. The absence of my jacket seemed minor but unsettling. Was someone watching me? I tried to push the thought out of my mind as I continued with my day. That evening, while preparing dinner, I noticed someone watching me from the edge of the forest. At first, it was just a shadow among the trees, but then I saw a figure standing still, almost blending into the darkness. I called out, but the figure didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the figure, but it vanished into the trees before I could get a clear look. My heart pounded as I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake the growing dread. The next day, while exploring the nearby trails, I stumbled upon something disturbing. A small, crudely made wooden totem with strange symbols carved into it. It was positioned in the middle of the trail as if meant to be discovered. I took a photo of it and decided to head back to the cabin, feeling increasingly uneasy. Later, I tried to research the symbols online but found nothing similar. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a deliberate attempt to unsettle me. My once peaceful retreat now felt like a trap. By the third night, my anxiety reached a peak. The noises outside grew louder and more frequent. Shadows moved past the windows, and I could hear footsteps circling the cabin. I tried to calm myself by focusing on the fire, but the sounds continued, growing closer. When I checked outside, the footsteps stopped abruptly. I felt a crushing sense of dread. I could no longer stay calm. I paced the cabin, checking and rechecking the locks, my nerves on edge. The sense of paranoia was overwhelming. The following morning, I decided to leave the cabin, feeling that it was no longer safe. However, when I went to start my car, it wouldn't start. The engine was dead. I had no cell signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I was stranded, alone, and growing more fearful by the hour. I tried to find another way to contact someone, but the isolation of the cabin made it impossible. The sense of entrapment was suffocating. I had no choice but to wait and hope that someone would notice my absence. As I explored the area around the cabin for any signs of help, I stumbled upon an old, hidden shed behind the trees. Inside, I found a collection of disturbing items, photos of other visitors to the cabin, their personal belongings, and what appeared to be a journal detailing their visits. The entries spoke of strange occurrences and the growing obsession of someone who clearly watched and manipulated guests. My blood ran cold as I realized the cabin was a lure for someone with a dark agenda. Panic-stricken, I knew I had to find a way out. I searched for any means of communication, finally finding an old radio in the cabin's attic. With shaking hands, I managed to get a distress signal out. While waiting for a response, I fortified the cabin as best as I could, keeping a watchful eye on the shadows moving outside. My fear grew with each passing hour. The sounds continued, but I could no longer tell if they were real or just my overactive imagination. Desperation drove me to a breaking point. Finally, help arrived, but it was too late for some of my belongings and the sense of safety I once had. The police found no trace of the mysterious figure or any of the disturbing items I had discovered. They assured me it was probably just a series of coincidences and my own heightened fears. Yet, as I left the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The haunting sense of being watched persisted, leaving me with a lingering fear that the terror was far from over.